Floods are the most common and most costly natural disaster. In fact, 75% of declared disasters in the United States involve flooding. In times of disasters and emergencies that are declared by the United States President, FEMA is able to help survivors with their disaster-related needs. The Individuals and Households Program, IHP, is a federal disaster assistance program that helps survivors address their uninsured or underinsured needs. The program has two provisions. Housing Assistance, HA, helps with housing needs, and Other Needs Assistance, ONA, helps with needs such as clothing, household appliances, and other disaster-related expenses that are necessary to recover from the effects of a disaster. The Group Flood Insurance Policy, GFIP, may be considered after survivors who have flood damage to their home or to its contents. The GFIP is a master flood insurance policy that provides disaster survivors a temporary means to have flood insurance coverage. The GFIP is good for a period of up to 3 years and is reserved for disaster survivors who reside in a pre-identified area that has a high probability of flooding. Also, receiving a GFIP allows disaster survivors to be in compliance with federal regulations when flood insurance is required to be maintained. At the end of the 3 years, disaster survivors who participate in the GFIP must purchase and maintain their own flood insurance in order to be eligible for future federal disaster assistance due to flood damage. This video will explain why the GFIP was created, how it is implemented, and what the responsibilities are for disaster survivors who participate in GFIP, as well as the administrative responsibilities of FEMA and state and tribal partners. The United States Congress has long been mindful of the hardships caused by floods. In 1968, in light of mounting flood losses and escalating costs of disaster relief to the taxpayers, Congress created the National Flood Insurance Program, or NFIP, to mitigate future flood losses through sound, community-enforced building and zoning ordinances. NFIP is administered by FEMA and provides property owners and renters access to federally backed flood insurance coverage that can be purchased with set rates through nearly 90 participating private insurance companies. Flood insurance from the NFIP is available to those residing in areas prone to flooding, regardless of a disaster event. However, if there is a presidentially declared disaster that includes flooding, the Individuals and Households Program may offer the GFIP. Previously, the Flood Disaster Protection Act of 1973 made the purchase of flood insurance mandatory for properties in special flood hazard areas. This requirement was further amended by the National Flood Insurance Reform Act, NFRA, of 1996, which requires individuals to purchase and maintain flood insurance as a condition of receiving disaster assistance. This is commonly referred to as the flood insurance requirement. Initially, FEMA awarded disaster assistance to disaster survivors to purchase flood insurance on their own, but they often chose not to do so. To ensure that disaster survivors meet the flood insurance requirement for receiving disaster assistance, the administrator will withhold the flood insurance premium payment from the Disaster Assistance Award. For each eligible disaster survivor, the premium amount is withheld from the Disaster Assistance Award and submitted to the NFIP to pay for an individual certificate of coverage. To be eligible for the GFIP, disaster survivors must have flood damage that was caused by a presidentially declared major disaster, reside in a special flood hazard area, SFHA, and be referred for IHP. A special flood hazard area is an area that is at high risk for flooding and where flood insurance is required as a condition of receiving disaster assistance through the IHP. Not every applicant may be considered for the GFIP, only those with flood insurable losses from a declared disaster event. Disaster survivors living outside special flood hazard areas are not eligible for the GFIP, nor can they purchase a GFIP. If they choose to obtain flood insurance, they may be able to purchase it individually through a private insurer of their choosing. The GFIP does not apply when flooding is not part of the disaster declaration. Flooding is part of the declaration, but an applicant has no flood damage to their home, or an applicant has damage to items that cannot be insured by the NFIP. The term of the GFIP is 3 years and begins after a 60-day waiting period from the disaster declaration date. Here's how it works. A flood event receives a presidential disaster declaration. The declaration date starts a 60-day waiting period before eligible disaster survivors may be issued a GFIP. For example, if the event is declared on July 1st, the GFIP becomes effective on August 29th. If the declaration is adjusted at a later date due at individual assistance programs, FEMA will then begin the registration period for survivors to apply for disaster assistance. But remember, the 60-day waiting period for GFIP always coincides with the original declaration date. Following registration and inspection of flood-damaged property, survivors who receive disaster assistance will be notified if they are required to purchase flood insurance as a condition of receiving assistance. The premium is paid on behalf of the survivor to the NFIP, which administers the GFIP. The survivor's name and property address are also provided. The recipient's coverage becomes effective 30 days after their name and premium payment is received by the NFIP. For example, if the NFIP receives the names and payments on August 20th, the coverage is activated September 19th. If the 30-day waiting period precedes the GFIP's effective date, the coverage will have the same effective date as the GFIP. For instance, if the FEMA applicant's information and premium payment were received by the NFIP on July 15th, the recipient's coverage does not become effective until August 29th, which is the same date that the GFIP becomes effective. It is important to know the GFIP will expire 3 years from the effective date. It takes a combined effort between the program administrator and the NFIP to ensure that eligible disaster survivors receive GFIP coverage. Survivors also have the responsibility to assure that their needs are met. The administrator is responsible for determining that a survivor's damaged dwelling is eligible for GFIP coverage. Eligibility is identified by the National Emergency Management Information System, NEMIS, a disaster assistance processing system. If eligible disaster survivors choose to live at their flood-damaged residence, the administrator is responsible for notifying eligible survivors in writing of the flood insurance requirement. The written notice also states that failure to obtain flood insurance may affect the ability to receive any future federal disaster assistance. The administrator will withhold the premium from each eligible survivor's disaster assistance award. Each eligible survivor's name and premium payment must be submitted together to the National Flood Insurance Program to ensure proper identification of those who are eligible for GFIP. It is the responsibility of the NFIP, upon receipt of the names and premium payment, to apply the 30-day waiting period, and then it will issue the flood insurance certificate of coverage to each eligible survivor. The NFIP is also responsible for addressing any questions and claims made by survivors who receive a GFIP. The NFIP will send copies of the certificates to the administrator, along with a list of the survivors, as proof of insurance for any covered flood loss during the policy term. Survivors who receive a GFIP have responsibilities as well. Survivors need to make sure their contact information is always up to date by accessing their account through disasterassistance.gov or contacting the FEMA helpline. Once a year, notifications will be mailed to remind survivors of their GFIP coverage status and to notify them of the policy expiration date. Notifications include a reminder of the requirement to maintain coverage by purchasing an individual flood insurance policy no less than 30 days before the expiration of the GFIP. Disaster survivors can voice any questions or concerns regarding their coverage by calling the telephone numbers contained within their notification letters. Survivors need to review every notification to make sure they understand how their property is covered by the GFIP, as explained in the certifications and summaries of coverage sent by the NFIP, which include addendums to what is and what is not covered. If a survivor wants to have more coverage than the GFIP, they will need to purchase their own flood insurance and cancel participation in the GFIP. They cannot have an individual flood insurance policy and a GFIP at the same time. The rules of the GFIP apply differently to disaster survivors who are classified as homeowners or renters. Homeowners must have flood insurance coverage for the structure, even if the damaged home is repaired or is demolished and rebuilt. As long as the address is located in a special flood hazard area, it will always carry the requirement for flood insurance. If an owner sells the home, they are required to inform the new owners that they must maintain flood insurance coverage to be eligible for future disaster assistance. Often, an individual flood insurance policy can be assigned to a new owner with no lapse in coverage. However, the owner of a property cannot transfer the GFIP to a different property. If the applicant is a renter, they must contact FEMA, as instructed in their notification letters, to confirm that they are going to continue residing at the flood-damaged rental unit. And as long as the renter resides at the rental unit, the renter must maintain flood insurance coverage on their personal contents. If the renter moves from the rental unit, they are no longer required to maintain flood insurance at that address. The GFIP does not transfer to subsequent renters when the disaster survivor moves. GFIP only applies to residential property. In addition, it is possible for a property to have more than one GFIP certificate. The owner of the building can have a certificate of coverage for their property, and any renters, for example, who are renting a room or a basement apartment from an owner of the same property can have a certificate of coverage for their contents. If subsequent flooding occurs during the GFIP term and causes property damage, the survivors may file a claim with the National Flood Insurance Program against their individual coverage through the GFIP, regardless of a presidential declaration. Homeowners have the option of making a claim for their building, contents, or a combination of both. Renters may only use the GFIP for contents. The amount of the GFIP coverage is adjusted annually and is equal to the individuals and households program's maximum, which is based on the Consumer Price Index. So the survivor's coverage amount may change over the 3-year term of the GFIP. When a claim is made against the GFIP, a set low-cost deductible will be applied separately to building and/or contents loss. During the 2nd and 3rd years of coverage, notification letters are sent to survivors participating in the GFIP, and 2 final notices will be mailed at approximately 60 days and 45 days prior to the expiration of the GFIP. Upon expiration of the GFIP, disaster survivors can purchase their own flood insurance policy from the NFIP. Survivors may purchase any combination of limits for their building and/or contents, which is also subject to the terms and conditions of a standard flood insurance policy. The purchase should be made prior to the expiration date, but no later than 30 days before the expiration of the GFIP to avoid a lapse in coverage. FEMA's GFIP ensures that eligible disaster survivors will have a safety net to recover from future flood damage, as well as comply with the flood insurance requirement when living in a special flood hazard area. No one can control when a flood might occur or how severe its impact may be. but homeowners and renters can prepare against its destructive effects. Flood insurance is the best defense against a greater financial loss resulting from flooding. For more information about disaster assistance programs, visit disasterassistance.gov or call toll-free 1-800-621-3362, including 911 or video relay service, or TTY at 1-800-462-7585. Information about flood insurance can be found by visiting floodsmart.gov.